How's it going, everybody? The voice of Ed Ricker here, and in front of me I have the DJI Air 2S and the Autel EVO 2 Pro 6K. In this video, I want to compare the footage and the picture quality at night with both of these drones. The reason is both drones have a 1-inch sensor size. They both also have, realistically, 5.4K max video resolution. Both sensors are rated at 20 megapixels, and they both have 10-bit log video recording. By the way, stay tuned for the end of this video where I talk about how the new FAA regulations in the United States allow Part 107 pilots to fly their drones without a night waiver. Part of that process is fixing an anti-collision light to your drone. In this case, I'm using the Lume Cube strobe. So let's bring up the first clip. We're going to start with the DJI Air 2S, and this is at 6400 ISO. This is at 30 frames per second. This is also at 1/30th second shutter speed. Even though that shutter speed is a little bit slower than I would prefer shooting in normal daytime conditions, we can get by at night just because we're trying to squeeze as much light out of this as we can. So at 6400 ISO, we see pretty dark shadows, and the lights, the highlights are pretty blown out. So if we look over here at this parking garage, we can see that there are some really bright lights going on. And then we see, of course, these rooftops are extremely dark. So there's a lot of contrast in this image. We can also see some grain, some noise in the image. And so if you see like on the horizon here, right above the city lights, it's kind of like a bunch of sandpaper. We're definitely seeing some noise in the image. Now let's go to the Autel EVO 2 Pro 6K. This is also at 1/30th second shutter speed. This is 6400 ISO, 30 frames per second. And we can already see the shadows are not quite as dark. It also seems to me that maybe the highlights are not quite as bright. So everything's kind of just centered up a little bit in the dynamic range scale. And we see a lot more detail in some of these places. We also see less noise on the horizon. So if you look over there, same spot as before, a lot less noise. Now, it may just be me, but I think I'm seeing also maybe some digital smoothing with the Autel drone. I'm not sure if that's translating through to YouTube or not, but if you see that, comment below. So far we're seeing that there's a lot more dynamic range in the Autel image. And of course, if we wanted to make this more contrasty and look like the Air 2S, because we do like those dark shadows and those bright highlights, we can add contrast to the image. But the great thing about this is we have a more flat color profile to begin with. Now let's bring up the log color profile, which, these both shoot 10-bit log, which is great. But we see here with the Air 2S, we're limited at 1600 ISO using D-log color profile. And that's kind of interesting to me. So it has a max of 6400 ISO under normal color profile, but you go to log and now you're limited to 1600. So even though we might have been able to get more dynamic range out of log color profile and then adding our lookup table with our Air 2S, we don't have our full ISO range, which is kind of funny. So we go to the Autel EVO 2 Pro 6K in log format, 10-bit, and 6400 ISO, which we can maintain under the log color profile. And wow, the colors come out so much. Look at this. So we still have lots of detail on these roofs. We have a lot of detail in these highlights and that type of thing, but the sky actually brightens up, which is really great. And you see the trees, they're so green. You see the building over here by Red Hat Amphitheater. I think that's the Raleigh Convention Center. The colors are coming out of that really nicely. So I'm really impressed with log color profile at night with the Autel EVO. With the Air 2S, I don't think log is really benefiting us at night at the moment. Now we could bring up the brightness of the DJI Air 2S log color profile here if we really wanted to. After all, we should have more information at 10-bit to maybe maintain some of those shadows, some of the detail in those shadows if we do bring up the shadows a bit. But the grain really comes in. We see a lot of grain. And look on the left of the image, I'm actually getting like a purple hue to the Air 2S image, and maybe even on the right a little bit. This glow could very well be from the lights on the drone itself. I'm led to believe that because I also see a small flicker from my anti-collision lights. I'm kind of surprised any of that's showing up in the video and I have a hard time justifying turning those lights off since they are part of the anti-collision lighting system. Now let's go a little bit wider here with the skyline. This is back maybe a mile or two. And so you can see a lot more darkness with the trees. There's a lot more shadow in this image. And so we're starting with the Autel EVO 2 Pro 6K this time. And you can kind of see that the autofocus didn't quite latch on. So the first time I'm panning here, it's actually out of focus. And I have to re-tap it. And luckily I thought to do that. And then finally it did focus. So autofocus is going to be an issue, I guess, pretty much with any drone that you fly in these lighting conditions with 6400 ISO. But either way, just make sure your autofocus is spot on by tapping if you need to on the screen. So with Autel EVO 2 Pro 6K, image looks pretty good. It's so far away though that we don't see a whole lot of detail, but that's to be expected. We'll go to the Air 2S, and you see that there is a difference in color temperature. So for this comparison of this particular angle of the city, I did have a discrepancy of color temperature. So again, we see a lot more grain in the image of the Air 2S, especially like in the parts of the image where there's a bright building right next to a very dark sky. That's where I'm seeing a lot of this grain come out of the woodwork. And let's bring out the log color profile again. So yeah, Autel EVO 2 Pro 6K is really winning with the log colored profile. Just looks great. And it is a little bit blue, I understand, but at the same time, it's coming through really nice on the screen. And we see the skyline, we see the horizon, the sky brighten up with the city lights. And the Air 2S in log color profile, locked in, topped out at 1600 ISO. Not quite as nice, kind of disappointing in comparison. Let's bring up our exposure in post-production just to see if we can get those shadows up a little bit. Yeah, look at that again on the left. And even a little bit on the right again, we see this weird purple hue. So log with the Air 2S is just not working for us. And here's a parking lot that I found. I actually shot this in a comparison video with the Mavic 2 Pro versus Mavic 2 Zoom. So if you're interested, you can actually see that comparison as well and play these two videos back to back. So this is going to be the Air 2S first. And so we see the parking lot, we see the lines on the pavement. And if you look at these lights and the illumination underneath each one of these parking lot lights, you can see where it kind of tapers off. That's where we're getting a lot of this noise again. So the noise isn't so much centralized on the light spots, but it is in the darker areas in between each of these radiant points. Now we'll go back to the Autel EVO 2 Pro 6K, and everything's a lot nicer. I mean, hardly any noise in comparison. This is actually really great. This test right here is probably one of the biggest improvements that I've seen so far, where the Autel EVO 2 Pro 6K is beating the Air 2S just for sheer image clarity and noise level. The still cameras on both drones have max 12,800 ISO. The Autel drone has hyperlight mode, however, and that's the mode you would use in low light conditions, like this one. It's going to get you the best low light results. However, if you select hyperlight, it's going to crop in significantly on your image. You're going to lose a lot of your field of view. If you exit out of hyperlight and you go back to single exposure mode or something else normal, that smaller field of view will not automatically revert back. So make sure that you revert back to your max resolution after you exit hyperlight mode. With the Air 2S, we see a similar image, and we don't see quite as much of a discrepancy in terms of how dark the shadows are and how bright the highlights are when you're comparing the two drones. So in photo mode, there's a little bit less of a difference. I think that's kind of interesting. So you have auto settings, or I think what the sweet spot here was 400 ISO and a half-second shutter speed, and that seems to kind of be the going perfect rate here for this particular condition. The DJI Air 2S also has smart photo mode, so it records a 20 megabit per second photo, but it uses advanced scene analysis to choose the best of three options. So it's going to be HDR versus hyperlight versus scene recognition. And apparently it's able to mix and match or choose one over the other to get the best scene possible. And honestly, this looks really good. We'll back out a little bit and we'll see this scene from farther away. And you can see that the Air 2S, it's looking pretty normal out here with either 400 ISO at 1 second shutter or 1600 ISO at a 1/3 second shutter. And then smart photo mode just brings out a lot of color in the sky. It almost looks like we have northern lights effect going on in the sky. I think that's clouds. So this is doing a really good job of getting a lot of dynamic range and a lot of information out of this particular scene in smart photo mode. And that might be one of my favorites right there. If we go back to the Autel EVO 2 Pro 6K, we got 1600 ISO at a 1/2 second shutter. Lots of detail in the sky. We're seeing some aircraft flying by over there. We also see just a nice horizon there. A lot of detail in the sky. And then we're going to go to 400 ISO at 1 second shutter. A little bit darker, obviously. And then our low light photo mode, which punches in again. So it's a much more narrow field of view. But we do get a lot of more information, a lot of detail in that sky and in the cityscape. Now, if we switch back and forth between Autel EVO low light mode versus Air 2S smart photo mode, first of all, it's very obvious that I have different color temperatures. So for this scene, yes, I did mix and match color temperatures by accident. But besides that, I kind of like the look of the smart photo mode. And the fact that we maintained our field of view with smart photo mode means we can punch in if we want to, but we still have our whole field of view versus low light mode, which punched in so much. I do like the clarity, I like the detail that I'm getting out of that. I miss my field of view. So with photos, honestly, I really like smart photo mode with the Air 2S. Obviously, though, the Autel EVO 2 Pro 6K wins out over the DJI Air 2S at night in video mode, which honestly I shoot the most in. I rarely take photos with my drone. I'm a videographer at heart. Also, just an important thing to note, neither of these drones have obstacle avoidance sensors that work very well in pitch black dark. But the DJI Air 2S was giving me repeated warnings during my live stream a week or two ago when I was doing my first night flight. And it turned out to be that the Lume Cube strobe, the way it was positioned, was kind of obstructing, or at least being sensed by, at least one of those top sensors on the drone's body. And I think that is why I was getting those strange obstacle avoidance error messages, even when I turned off obstacle avoidance. Remember, when the obstacle avoidance action is set to off, the drone will not be able to avoid obstacles. However, the sensing system still works. That's why the app will prompt you about the error when the sensors detect something, even when you have obstacle avoidance turned off. That's what was happening. So I mentioned in the beginning of this video that the FAA in the United States now allows remote pilots under Part 107 to fly at night without a waiver, as long as certain criteria is met for the flight and for what we're doing. So if you go to the link in the video description, there is an article on the FAA.gov website. If you scroll down, you see night operations. It says this rule allows routine operations of small UAS beginning April 21st at night under 2 conditions. First, the remote pilot in command must complete an updated initial knowledge test or online recurrent training. And the small unmanned aircraft must have lighted anti-collision lighting visible for at least 3 statute miles that has a flash rate sufficient to avoid a collision. So for that first point, the remote pilot in command must complete an updated initial knowledge test. So I completed my recurrent Part 107 test 2 years after my last one on February 1st. That's just to keep updated, to keep recurrent with my Part 107 certificate. Since the rules changed and things have changed since then, that means that as of April 21st, there is a new knowledge test and online recurrent training. So even though I'm recurrent, I still wouldn't be able to fly at night under these new rules unless I take the updated recurrent training, which I did, as long as you also have your anti-collision lighting. So that Lume Cube strobe that I attached and I showed at the beginning of this video would satisfy that 3 statute miles of visibility. That's how I'm able to fly at night under Part 107 now, and I just wanted to give you all an update on that fact. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and until next time, happy flying.